Hi, I'm Jay Andrews with Laguna Tools. Today, we're going to open up and run the 1938 Supermax combination sander. This is both a drum and brush sanding machine to give you the maximum flexibility in your shop. Now your sander will arrive in a crate that's like this. It's sort of an open form crate, and you'll want to walk around and inspect it when it arrives. Make sure that there's no damage to the crate. If there is, look inside at the boxes and note any type of damage that you can see physically on the external crate or on the inside, right on the shipping manifest, on that shipping receipt, so that they have a record of it. Once you open up the boxes inside, examine any of the parts for damage, and if you should see any damage on those parts inside, give us a phone call within 48 hours so that we can open up a service claim here for you. Next up is to go through and grab a hammer, a pry bar, and let's get the top lifted off this crate and pull the boxes out. Now all we have left is the body of the sander itself. This is the single largest and heaviest component of the machine. Get a friend to help you lift this out and off the pallet. Now that I've got everything uncrated, I've got the machine out, I'm going to go through and set up the stand first before opening up the machine. This will give me a nice platform so that when I lift the machine out, I can set it right up onto the stand where it's going to go. Inside the box, there's a one-page setup sheet for the stand. It's a parts list on the front, instructions on the back. There's a few little steps in here that you want to pay attention to so that the stand goes together correctly. Now, assembling the stand is pretty straightforward. There are 4 legs. You're going to do them in pairs, and so grab 2 legs and one of the short end pieces here. And when you look at the legs, you're going to see that there are 2 different types, one with and one without a hole in the tops of the legs, and you want to grab one of each, and that's a pair. These legs are going to be canted inwards like this, and the small section is going to go and bolt up at the top. When you're lining these legs up, you'll see that the feet are at an angle. Just make sure that the angle is correct, and that'll be the setup for the legs. I find that it's easiest to install the leveling feet right now, or if you have the optional mobility kit, you can install the mobility kit wheels right now. First thing you'll do is insert one of the nuts all the way down, and that'll be a jam nut. Then a washer, and then insert the leveling foot through the leg, then the washer, and finally the lock nut on the top. Typically during setup, I'll install these all the way up, and then I can lower those down later to level it to my shop. Repeat the process on the other leg. Finally, tighten the leg bolts using a 9/16 wrench. Okay, so grab the short upper tie bar here and set it on the inside of the legs. All of the top members here, the short one and the long ones, will be on the inside of the legs. Next, grab the carriage bolt, insert it from the bottom, and start a nut on that. Leave these finger tight. You don't want to tighten these up yet because you're going to do some positioning of the stand as it gets assembled. Okay, now I've got one of the leg end assemblies done, and you can see that those bolts are nice and loose. That'll let me fit the bottom shelf in quite easily. Now repeat the process for the other set of legs. Now grab 4 more of the carriage bolts, 4 more of the lock nuts, and finally 2 of the long uprights. These uprights are going to install on top of the little short top piece, but behind the leg. So they're going to slide right into this slot and then line up the square holes. Now the long cross arm should overlap the top of the short piece, and you want to make sure that these holes line up before you put the bolts in. Now before moving forward, just double check and make sure that you've got everything lined up. These holes should line up right here, and that's where the machine's going to drop in. You should have the short piece and the long pieces on top, the legs on the outside. Now grab 4 more carriage bolts, 4 more lock nuts, and repeat the process with the other leg. I like to flip this down and lay it on the box. Now with all 4 legs on, you want to double check to make sure that these holes line up in all 4 corners here before you proceed any further. The final piece to install is the lower shelf, and it'll rest right between the taper of the legs. Let that set into place and then grab some bolts to insert. I usually start with one end, get a couple bolts started, and go to the other end. Insert the carriage bolt on the opposite leg. You may find it's easier to have somebody hold the opposite end, but it should nest in place there as you're getting these started. Again, leave these finger tight. I'll come back and put the side bolts in just a minute. Okay, now that these 4 bolts are in, grab 4 more and then do the other face. So far, we've kept everything nice and loose just to go through and assemble it. Now it's time to tighten up these nuts and bolts. Grab a 1/2-inch wrench and start working your way around each corner here to tighten down all these little carriage bolts. You'll see that the carriage bolts with the square holes tend to square this thing up as you go along. Just make sure it's set on a flat surface. And finally, as you're doing this, check these holes to make sure that they stay aligned as you're tightening everything down. That'll make assembly of the sander go a lot easier. Okay, that's the last one. Now it's time to flip this over and get it on the ground. I'm going to go ahead and just roll it off the box easily. Finally, slide it to the side in preparation to set the sander on it. Open up the sander box. Now I find that it's best to start cutting the box away from the sander so I can get a good grip on it and lift it onto the stand. All right, now with the box out of the way, start pulling the plastic out of the way. And finally what I'll do is I'll cut the plastic away so I can grip onto the machine and not worry about grabbing plastic as I'm trying to lift a 200-pound machine. Now I've positioned a 4x4 just behind the machine. I'll lift up the light into the machine. And finally, slide this 4x4 underneath it. Now I can unbolt the little plywood skids that are on the bottom of the machine. First, remove the bottom 2 bolts on the bottom of the skid. This is a 9/16 wrench. There's a couple methods to get the other end up, but it's heavy. So if you need a hand, get somebody to help you do this. You can actually grab the light end, tip it up, and then move that 4x4 a little further under, and then finally rock it up and pull the skid off from the other side. Again, grab somebody else to help you if you need a hand. Now, using the 4 bolts that you just removed that held the skids on, get those ready to go because you're going to bolt the machine to the stand using those bolts. Now, I've removed the cardboard from out of the work area so I don't trip. I'm going to get a helper to help me lift the machine. This is really heavy. You definitely want to have two people as you lift this up. This will be the heavy end, and that'll be the lighter end, but both of them are heavy. Also, make sure that your stand is level right now. Right now, when there's no machine weight on it, it's a great time to go through and set those leveling feet or the casters to make sure that it's flat and stable before you put a machine on it. Now that the machine is up on the stand, you can go through and just slide it gently to line it up over the holes and insert the bolts from the bottom. Again, we lifted this up with two people. If you need a third person, grab a third person to help you lift it. As you're lining up the machine to insert the bolt holes, have somebody spot you by holding the machine on the other end. We've got this one lined up, I think. That's great. And then finally tighten those down after you have them all inserted with a 9/16 wrench. The machine is going to overhang the frame by about a 1/4 inch or so on each side. Just go ahead and get it centered with a little bit of reveal there on each side, and then have somebody spot you on the other end as you put the bolts in. Now with somebody holding the other end of the machine, just gently wiggle it until you have the holes lined up. Insert the bolts, and then finally tighten them down with a 9/16 wrench. In a bag in the hardware box, you're going to find this knob inserted into the hand wheel. Simply thread that down, and once you get that all the way down, snug up the lock nut with the included wrench. Now that the hand wheel is installed, go ahead and raise the machine up so that you can remove the shipping block. This block is put in place to stabilize the head when your machine is shipped to you. Now locate the box that contains the conveyor assembly. And we'll open this box up and lay it down on the floor. Pull out the styrofoam right now. It's probably easiest to lay the box down and then finally to pull out the conveyor assembly. Before installing the conveyor table, remove the two nuts that are on the end of the machine, and then finally the two Allens that are on the opposite side. Take your hardware and set it on the shelf right below the machine. The inboard screws use an Allen wrench that's included in the bag to loosen. Before you loosen those, make sure that this fast lever is in the up position and out of your way. If it was pushed down during shipping, make sure it's in the up position before you go any further. Finally, loosen these screws and remove them. Again, set those down onto the shelf, and those will be reinstalled after the conveyor table is in place. As you remove the nut and bolt, make sure to leave this plate in place. We're going to bolt down through that, and the conveyor is going to sit right on top. To give yourself plenty of room to install the conveyor table, go ahead and raise the sanding head of the machine just to give a little more clearance. Now grab the conveyor table and bring it in from the side, and be careful not to drag the conveyor belt itself on those studs. Rest the far end in place, and then gently line up the flange over these two studs. Now, using the hardware that you removed previously, first install the flat washer onto the stud, then the lock washer, and then finally the nut. Leave these finger tight as you make the adjustments for the far side. Now, over at the inboard side of the machine, you'll confirm that you've got this thing set up correctly by having the IntelliSand motor next to the main motor of the machine. Finally, line up the hole with the small plate that holds it in place. I've got that set up. Let me get my washers loaded onto the bolt. And finally, run that in finger tight and do the same on the back side. On the outfeed side of the table, I find it's easiest just to reach under the table to align that plate that sits between the table flange and the frame itself. Next, install the screw here with the Allen top on it and run that down finger tight. The setting for the tension on this screw is fairly critical. The quick lever allows you to make adjustments when running wider boards through the machine. So the first thing I'll do is sort of wiggle the table as I'm tightening this down finger tight. I like to move this lever down and just a tiny bit more than finger tight with the Allen screw, but not very much. So I'll go through and just take it right there and finally confirm that the lever has free motion. Finally, back on the outside edge, tighten the two nuts that hold the conveyor to the machine frame. Now you'll find the two cords that come out of the bottom of the variable frequency drive, and you'll plug these over into the side of the IntelliSand box. Simply install those two cords into the side. The 1938 combination machine ships around the world. Now, depending on which country you're in, it may arrive in different configurations. If your machine shows up and it has a cord and a plug on it, you're ready to plug the machine in and get going with it. If your machine arrives without a cord and a plug, you'll need to install a power cord and a plug on your machine that matches your power in your country. For 110 volt applications like we use in North America, you'll have a power cord that has 3 conductors. It's going to have a green for ground, a black for power, and a white for neutral. Those connections are made inside the box right here. In order to access those connections, just simply remove the screw at the front of the box. The lower plate will slide off and provide access for this wiring. Once the screw is out, this plate simply slides forward and off the machine. Reinstalling the cover is just a simple matter of sliding the tabs into the notches in the rear and then finally reinstalling the screw in the front. If you're not comfortable installing your own cord and plug on a machine if required, then call a qualified electrician to come out and install the cord and plug for you. Well, now that we've got the machine wired up and ready to go, I've plugged the machine in and we're going to start the machine up. But I want to talk a little bit about safety first. You'll see that this upper cover is the dust collection port, but it also provides safety for the sanding head. You'll see that the sanding head is exposed when you open the cover. There's a nice heavy-duty latch that's on the front to protect you. And then finally, you want to make sure that you've got your safety glasses on. Let's go ahead and start up the machine and watch it run. The first thing I'm going to check is the table feed. And I can turn that up to 100%, and this is full motion, or I can reduce that as well. So that's working great. The next thing I want to do is to start the sanding head, and that's just simply flipping the switch right here. I can confirm that the sanding head is working. That's great. Now we're ready to run some boards through. Now that we've confirmed operation of the feed table and the brush head, it's time to talk about the brush head alignment. And you'll check that alignment between the brush head itself and the table. It should come preset from the factory, but if you need to make any adjustments, those instructions are in your owner's manual, and it's a simple matter to make that adjustment. The other thing that you'll want to do is to make sure that your speed matches the type of brush head that you have inside. If you're running a brush, you want to run the RPMs from about 200 to a maximum of 1,000 RPM, no faster than that for a brush. If it's a sanding drum that's in the machine, you'll spin the drum at 1750. That adjustment is done with this knob right here where you can control the speed, and this handy little chart gives you an indication of where that speed knob should be. Now I've gone ahead and connected the P-Flux dust collector, so we've got great dust collection here for the sander. I've grabbed a sample of wood to send through the machine. Finally, I want to go through and set my adjustments. Now, for the first time through, I want to be very conservative on the machine. I will set the speed on the sanding head fairly slow, as well as the feed speed for the table. And then I'm going to sneak up on the surface of the wood by incrementally lowering the head down as we go. The first thing I'll do is bring my board in and just gradually lower that until it touches the pressure roller. There we go, I've got it touching. I'm going to raise it up just slightly. I don't want too much pressure from that sanding head on a first pass here. So there we go, I've got that set pretty good. Let's go ahead and turn on the dust collector. Start the feed belt and finally the sanding head. Boy, this sanded surface came out great. Now we're using the flatter head, and the flatter head is great for just light sanding. It's good for doing sanding between sealer coats of finish. It's also great for getting into the texture of carved wood, something like a cabinet door, for example, or moldings. It's great for that. You can't go too aggressive on this head though. It's just light passes and sneak up on that sanding finish that you're looking for. Let's go ahead and run a cabinet door through the machine next. This flatter head is really great for doing a wide range of different tasks, including cleaning up some wood, just like this piece of reclaimed wood here. We're going to go through and run this through the machine just to clean it up a little bit. I don't want to remove the patina from it completely, but I want to clean up the face of this a little bit. Let me go ahead and get set up with the height here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get the sanding head on, dust collection on, and finally we'll turn the feet on. Well, you can see that it's cleaned up the board, it's eased the edges just slightly, but it hasn't gone through that patina layer that we want. You can see that the other side is quite bright, and that still lets us look like a reclaimed wood. This is fantastic for going through and doing some of the finishes that are really popular nowadays. The 1938 Combo is truly a versatile machine, and that's thanks to the range of sanding heads that are available for the machine. Currently, we have the flatter head in the machine. I'm going to change over to the wire brush head and show you how to distress some wood. First thing I want to do is make sure the machine is unplugged. Secondly, I want to go through and start removing the head. The first step is to loosen the nuts on the inside and then remove the carriage bolts on the outside. If the nut drops, you'll be able to pick it up just as soon as you remove the sanding head. With the nuts removed, pull out the carriage bolts and the outer bearing retainer plate. It's a little snug. Now that the outer bearing is free, let's go through and repeat the process on the inside bearing. On the inside of the head, repeat the process with the two nuts on the motor side. I find that a ratcheting wrench works a lot easier than a standard opening wrench. Once these nuts are off, remove the carriage bolts and push the inner flange back over the motor shaft. Here's the flange, just slide it backwards. The 1938 Combo has this unique coupler right here that has a little, what they call a spider coupler in the middle, and that's a rubber dampener. In order to remove the sanding head, we're going to loosen two set screws on the inside portion of the coupler. Insert your Allen wrench and loosen those set screws up. And then finally, once those are loose, we're going to push that portion of the coupler back. Grab a flat bladed screwdriver and slide it between the two halves of the coupler and gently tap down and force that inside portion of the coupler back. Once that's loose, it's simply a matter of lifting on the outside of the head. Lift the head, and as necessary, wiggle the coupler to loosen it. Finally, we'll go through and remove the spider rubber insert. When you store your heads, it's best to hang these on the wall. You can set up a hook and hang these heads, or cut a notch into a sheet of plywood and hang several of them in a row. Here's the wire brush head. I'll get it set in place here on the table, and then I'm going to put this little spider thing there just to keep it from rolling off. Now this is a brand new wire brush head, and you can see it's got the plastic wrap on, which makes it really convenient to move around. If you're doing this with one that you've already run, a used head, then put gloves on as you're handling it so you don't get poked. Before installing the bearings or any of the flanges, make sure you give the shaft a good wipe. Make sure that there's no debris on there. Next, install the bearing flange onto the shaft and then slide the bearing on. First, check to make sure that the Allen screws are backed off so they don't hang up on the shaft. With those set screws backed off, gently slide this right onto the shaft and align the rear of the bearing flange with the ridge that's in the shaft. With the rear of the bearing aligned, simply tighten down the two Allen screws to fix the bearing onto the shaft. And snug the set screws. Now rotate it to where the keyway on the shaft is pointed up. And verify that the keyway is clean. Insert the small key that is supplied with the brush head. Next, grab the coupling. Ensure that the set screws are backed off so it will slide easily onto the shaft. Align the keyway in the coupling with the key on the shaft and slide it into position. You'll want to space it away from the bearing and use your Allen wrench as a gauge for the spacing. Next, tighten down the set screws onto the keyway and then snug that down, and then repeat the process on the other set screw. With the motor side done, flip the head over and position the outside toward the outside. Put your stop in place and clean the shaft. On the outside of the brush head, we're going to slide on the bearing retainer and next the bearing, and again check those set screws to make sure that they're backed off. Slide this into place on the shaft, and finally align the outside edge of the bearing with the outside of the shaft, and then tighten both set screws. Now we're just about ready to install the brush head, but first I want to put in the little rubber spider connector here, and that'll press right into the end of the shaft. Install the bearing flange over the motor shaft for the rear bearing. The bearing flange is going to wait right there just hanging out until we get the shaft in place, and then finally we'll pull it forward and tighten it down. You'll want to take the keyway that's on the rear coupler and rotate it down to where it's in this position to insert the brush head. And gently lower the brush head on the outside edge while pushing inwards on the coupler. Gently tap on the bearing flange if you need to rotate it into position. I like to level off the brush head. There's a little bit of play up and down, and that'll help me slide the coupler in place. First, I'll start with the outer edge, and then I'll go to the inboard edge. take the outer bearing flange, slide it over the bearing, and then finally run your bolts through the cast iron frame. You don't have to put the nuts on yet. We're just going to level this up, and this gives me a little bit of play with the brush head. I'll raise that up, slide the bolt in place there. Now I've done the outer edge, let's do the inside edge. Now slide the inner bearing flange over so that it meets the other bearing flange and line up the holes. Next, install the bolt through both of the bearing flanges. And you may have to rotate that up. I find that lifting gently on the bottom of the brush head will help me to install that bolt. And while supporting the brush head, grab the bolt and insert it through both of the bearing flanges again. You may have to wiggle the head a little bit to get it through. Now I'm not going to put it on the nuts yet. I'm going to go through and get the flange started. Now that I've got the two halves of the coupling lined up, I'm going to go through and just work it forward using just a little bit of prying motion here with the screwdriver. And it's okay to leave an air gap right between the two. You want a little bit of a gap. Now that those two halves are brought together and that I have the air gap, it's time to go through and tighten up all the set screws. With the two coupler halves locked in place now it's time to install the nuts on the bearing flanges. I'll start with the inboard one. I find it's helpful to use this little ratcheting box-in wrench to make this easy. Once that gets started, I can just pinch the wrench and the nut together and tighten it down. Once you get these close, you'll want to alternate back and forth between the rear and the front to make sure that that bearing seats evenly. Okay, now just as the rear one starts to come in contact, I'll pull that down a little bit and switch back to the front and alternate back and forth. Back to the back, and then finally back to the front again. And then just check to make sure both of those are nice and snug. On the opposite end here, you'll find that sometimes these heads can get a little bit tight between the edge of the cast iron and the flange. So I will push the bolt out a little bit, slide the nut over it, and then finally push the bolt back in. Give the nut a few turns. And this is one area, if it's a tight brush head, I'll use the open end of the wrench to make this a little bit easier. I'll do the same for the forward nut. Line it up, push it in, and then start a few turns on the nut. Oops. I just dropped that one, so I'll slide it out. If you drop the nut, no big worries, you can slide it right out the front of the machine. There we go. Move the bolt back out and do that one again. Slide it forward. Get a few turns on that nut. And then finally, tighten both those down with a wrench. Give the head a few spins to make sure that everything is free. It looks great, so I'm going to go through and peel this plastic off. Again, if you're doing this with an older head, make sure you wear gloves for this procedure so you don't get nicked by the wire. The wire will be harsh on your skin. There we go. Now, one word of caution on this. With this machine, you can see that the wire brush is pretty small. If you're going to be doing a ton of flooring and other stuff that you need to have distressed, make sure that you step up a notch and go to the super brush machine that has a longer wire to it. Those tend to be a little bit better for commercial applications. This one's great for smaller shops, hobby shops, and so forth. Now I've got this beautiful piece of redwood here with a nice live edge. I'm going to go through and distress this wood by wire brushing it with the machine here. Now one thing you want to make sure that you do is just take a super light pass. You don't want to go down more than about a 32nd of an inch or so into the surface. You're going to get a great texture. If you want more texture, make a second pass through there, but don't go more than that. You don't want to be too aggressive because you can shorten the life of the brush head. Now that we've got this set, I'm going to go through and get my dust collection turned on. Start up the brush head, get the feed going. And we're just going to sneak up on that here. On the first pass, I'm just going to come down lightly. I'm not quite touching yet. Pick that up on the second pass. Each turn is about a 1/16 of an inch. I'm going to go about half that right now. We're not quite touching yet. The brushes are touching, but just lightly. And I'll give that another pass. And again, that's going to be about half a turn. Boy, the texture from this wire brush is amazing. And I don't know if that shows up on camera or not, but you can certainly feel it. Now the wire brush is a pretty aggressive head on certain types of wood. And if you want a nice textured feel, but a little bit smoother finish, run it through the wire brush first and then follow that up by using the nylon head. The nylon head will go through and sand out some of those wire brush scratches. Let's go ahead and change the head on this. We'll show you the nylon brush and some other things that it can do. Okay, let's get the nylon head in here. Okay, now I've installed the nylon head. This is an 80 grit nylon brush head, and this is great for doing some lightweight sanding. I'm going to take this piece that I've already wire brushed. I'm going to take a little bit of the rough portion of the texture off it and just leave some of that nice grain on the wood. And then finally I'll sand some other pieces as well. Let's go ahead and get this shut down, get the dust collector fired up, and get this moving. Boy, this 80 grit nylon brush has done a fantastic job. It's removed any fine little splinters that I might have had left over from the wire brush. It's eased the edges also, and this is ready to go to finish. Now, when passing pieces through any of the brushes, the wire brush or the nylon brush, you want to take slow, easy passes going through on the material. You don't want to flex the brush too much because that can shorten the life of the brush head. If you're doing a lot of this material, you may want to consider stepping up and going to the super brush machine, which is designed for industrial use. The size of the brush head is considerably larger, and it lets you be just a little bit more aggressive on your brush passes, both the nylon and the steel brushes. Now I've gone ahead and installed the sanding drum, and it's outfitted with an 80 grit paper. And of course you can change out papers. I'm going to go ahead and start with the 80 grit to clean up this board. This board here has got the patina on it that we had when we did the flapper sander. I'm going to try to clean it up and have it look a little bit like that. The one thing you want to do is make sure that you've got your speed increased, and that's over here on the variable frequency drive. For the drum head, you're going to bring that speed up to about 1750 and run your boards through at that range. Let's go ahead and get this thing fired up. Get my dust collector going. Boy, that sanding drum really does a great job. And you can see that not only did it sand that finish to bring out that beautiful red tone of this redwood, but it also smoothed out the knots that were on this piece. Did a great job. Now, with the sanding head, it has a lot less forgiveness than some of the brush heads because the paper is so thin and it's right against an aluminum drum. And so for that reason, you really want to sneak up on those passes. If you make a light pass first, just as it just starts touching, then you can kind of gradually lower that head down and get the beautiful finish that we've done here. That's the best way to do it. If you go too aggressive, you can burn the paper. One other note, you may want to get one of the sandpaper cleaning sticks. It's like a great big eraser, and you rub it across this head, and it helps to clean out the sawdust from the sanding head, and it extends the life of your paper. Now you can find other accessories for this machine on our website at lagunatools.com, including different grit sandpapers, the caster set, and other accessories. If you have any questions, give us a call, toll-free 800-234-1976, or again, look us up at lagunatools.com.